I am heating up. Or am I? Smart guy says it doesn't exist. New smart guy says it exists, so does it?
They don't have a hot hand.
Well, the hot hand might seem like just a playful debate.
It's not something special happening. It is the randomness.
Recent discoveries and meaning have much larger implications in the game of basketball.
It's a bias that shapes important decisions.
Momentum might not be magic.
That is Vinnie Johnson. Vinnie was the definition of heat. A street player that was so embolic of the hot hand, he earned the nickname the microwave.
But then smart guys came along and did what smart guys do. Ruin everything. At least they said there was no such thing as heat. Gilovich, Valone, and the famous Avos Tversky performed a proverbial heat check. This study, we'll call it GVT, was thorough in its findings, monumental.
So first they looked at the perception of fans and players.
These were Stanford and Cornell students, who unsurprisingly believed in momentum in a variety of ways. They then looked to the NBA, specifically the 76ers and Julius Erving. This time, testing if the previous shot had any effect on the next shot. For example, if a player made the previous shot, did it influence anything? No hot hand was found. In fact, they found the inverse.
And next they decided to look at free throws with teams like the Boston Celtics.
In study 3, they looked at the Celtics free throw shooting. A free throw provides a more controlled experiment, a closed skill, so to speak, a more controlled shot with less variables. And looking at this Celtics team, did a prior free throw have any influence on the following?
Again, no evidence for this hot hand was found, but in study 4, perhaps the most cited controversial study, they looked at Cornell students in a closed session. The students were placed around the arc at distances where they shot roughly 50%, which for Cornell students is strictly right-handed layups. Nerds. If there was momentum or heat, the students should shoot better after 3 makes than they do after 3 misses. But, yet again, there was no indication of heat. So what was the reception to this? Well, fans and players certainly denied it. And famous coach Red Auerbach said, yeah, so a guy makes a study. I couldn't care less. But over time, there was this one-way statistical landslide that showed the hot hand might indeed be a fallacy, a cognitive illusion. No different than the gambler's fallacy. And our peasant pattern-seeking brains, they just can't tell the difference between randomness and correlation. Counter follow-ups on players like the microwave were disproved and dismissed. This was just math. There was no momentum. Each shot was independent from another. And media and movies fallacy. And books like this would go on to remind us that we were intuitive idiots yet again. Chalk another one up to the nerds. But then, over 30 years later, someone would notice a small but significant error, one that would upend decades worth of studies in belief.
Turned into much bigger than we expected.
So a few years ago, professors Adam Samgiro and Joshua Miller didn't set out to prove anyone wrong. They just thought the original GVT test was a little oversimplified and it could be improved.
We were independently skeptical, and Adam said, hey, why don't we do this? Actually have people shoot the basketball.
So Joshua and Adam set up a test with 8 professional Spanish players on the same team. 300 shots from each player in 3 different sessions.
So to motivate these players, they let them know they get 10 euros for makes on random shots. So obviously the incentive is aligned here to make as many shots as you could.
The original GVT study had this very strong conclusion that the hot hand just does not exist.
Well, once you say the hot hand doesn't exist, all you have to do is show it exists some of the time in some people.
And you guys found, for some of the players, that they did improve, in this case, after 3 makes.
Yes.
This was a big deal, and they followed it up by asking the players, of their teammates, who did they think was more likely to experience heat? Who was a streakier shooter, so to speak?
We asked them, rank your teammates from 1 to 7 on how hot they tend to get.
and the players intuitively predicted who they thought was more likely to get hot. There was a positive correlation, a fairly strong one.
The key thing is the way they're identifying it is retrospective. The evidence we have is people, based on their playing history, can identify who tends to get hot more than others.
The key word there is retrospectively. That is, players in general can tell who is more likely to experience heat in the past, but as far as in-game, there's just too much noise. It's too difficult to tell who's experiencing heat in the moment. So this was huge. Joshua and Adam had evidence of the hot hand, and they had evidence that players intuitively could tell who was more likely to get the hot hand. So what was the feedback of this study?
It didn't have as much of an impact as we had hoped.
Problem was Miller and Sanjuro didn't disprove any of the other studies. So what? You had a few Spanish dudes that made a few shots, but nobody cares.
Okay, so I guess what we're going to need to do, maybe get a little bit more juicy. Juicy.
Full day supply of
The three-point contest isn't just entertainment. It's perhaps the greatest controlled shooting experiment there is. A live audience, a defined shot in distance, the world's greatest marksman, and importantly, a reward. And there's one particular marksman, one that a lot of people haven't heard of, that would become the focal point of the greatest reversal in scientific belief on momentum in decades. Craig Hodges was odd. He came into the league anything but a shooter. He was 22, then 21% from deep in his first 2 seasons. Then something changed, and he would go on to the three-point contest and do something unimaginable.
19 in a row. If there's such a thing as heat, this would have to be it.
He clearly has it. Let's just apply the original test to this thing. And so we did it, and it wasn't showing much. It was like showing nothing.
How could this be? Craig was a walking flamethrower in this contest, but he was showing little to nothing.
Cognitive illusions are powerful. If there's one thing we know, we want heat to exist. So much so that we pump 4 billion quarters just to get a pixelated taste of it.
video games fever.
Boom shakalaka!
Now, when NBA Jam was in its beta test, the machine was malfunctioning. When Mark heard this, he went to go check it out himself.
But it wasn't malfunctioning.
The machine was full of quarters.
Video games are taking this country by storm.
Employees had to start emptying NBA Jam every hour. To put this in perspective, if a game made $150 in its testing week, it was a bust. If a game made $1,500, it was a smash hit. NBA Jam made $2,468.
This is bad, man! This is bad!
Sports games had never done this. They were difficult to gamify because inherently they were already games. But as author Ben Cohen writes, this game was different. Not because of enhanced graphics, but because of a subtle, powerful chord.
And it was this chase that flamed record-breaking sales. 80s and 90s kids like myself in the Spokane Valley filling machines as much as we could with any spare change we could find.
There's this analog authenticity that makes arcades so special. Different worlds full of 8-bit soundtracks, arcades place us inside of a dream. They pull us out of reality. But fundamentally, they are simulations, illusions. And back on Earth, every legitimate study had proven that the hot hand was no different. That that is, until Josh and Adam noticed this peculiarity with the three-point contest. So they looked deeper into the original GVT study with the Cornell students. Since a make or miss is binary, we can apply this test to something basic, a coin flip simulation.
And what did it say? You know, the percentage of heads after 3 heads in a row is lower than the percentage of heads after 3 tails in a row. Like, well, we know that's not true. The coin always has the same chance, can't remember. There's something wrong with the test.
So Miller had taken perhaps the greatest statistical outlier there was, Craig Hodges, who had made 19 freaking threes in a row, and the results were room temperature.
How in the world could this be possible?
So when I first read Joshua and Adam's paper, I struggled to wrap my head around this mathematical error, and that's because it's an illusion. Kahneman even said so, and if it evaded people like him for basically 3 decades, you know this is tricky. But rather than just say big words, I want to show you what this error is, because it might change the way that you view the world. Part of that original forced study in GVT looked at how students shot after 3 makes and 3 misses. That is, the shot following 3 makes and the shot following 3 misses. The difference between the two to see if students were shooting any better after a series of makes. They took the Cornell students along the arc where they shot roughly 50%.
They put them on each side of the arc, and then they would move, so they weren't always in the same position. And they ended up shooting like 47%, so they were right.
Now, GVT's conclusion was rather absolute in stating there was no evidence for a hot hand. Players did not shoot better after a series of 3 makes in comparison to after a series of 3 misses. GVT's conclusion, along with virtually every other paper that was published after, each shot was an independent action. It did not matter what happened before. And that means we can think of shots like they're memoryless, a chance event, which means we can think of them like a coin flip. Let's simplify this. Let's assume that heads is a hit and tails is a miss. Instead of looking at a longer streak of what happens after 3 hits and 3 misses, let's just look at what happens after 1 hit and 1 miss. Say we were to flip this coin 3 times, as if a player were shooting 3 times, and we just wanted to compare how the player shot after 1 hit and after 1 miss. There are 8 different possible combinations of this. Miss, 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 hit, miss, and so on. So stepping through this sequence, I will place shots that follow a hit in the black cup and shots that follow a miss in the red cup. Miss, miss, miss was the first combination, which means we shot 0% after misses. That also means both of these shots go into the miss cup. There were no shots that followed a hit, so we can't measure anything here. And that means we can't measure a difference between these two, so we can't really do much with this combination. The second combination is miss, miss, hit. So we had 2 shots again that followed misses here. One of those shots was a miss. The other shot was a hit. That again followed a miss. There were no shots that followed a hit in this second combination. So again, we can't compute the difference here. In our third possible combination, we finally have a shot that follows a hit. We have a miss following a hit, therefore we shot 0% after hits. That goes into the black cup. We also have a hit that followed a miss. Therefore, we shot 100% after misses. The difference between these two, minus 100%. Playing this out for the remaining combinations, we only have 4 sequences where we can compute a difference. And if we look at those 4 possible differences, the key measurement in the original study, we'll notice it's never positive. The player's field goal percentage after hitting a shot is either the same or worse when compared to after missing a shot. It's never better or positive. That means the bias is negative 50%, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense because a coin is memoryless. Why would there be a bias? But The GBT study looked at what happened after a series of 3 makes in comparison to what happened after a series of 3 misses. With this coin flip study, we were just looking at what happened after 1 hit in comparison to what happened after 1 miss. Maybe if we ratchet this up, again, we'll find that this is just oversimplified. So what happens if we were to play this out and look at the difference after streaks of 3 instead of after 1? Simulating this 10,000 times, you would expect about a negative 8% bias. So it wasn't surprising that they didn't find a hot hand. It was expected.
This is a restricted choice example, similar to the famous Monty Hall problem.
Correcting for this mistake was a monumental reversal. Again, the original GBT study found no difference after 3 makes, no heat. But upon adjusting for this error, shooters in this study were 13 percentage points more likely to make a shot following 3 makes. That's the difference between the worst starting point guard, sorry Westbrook, and Steph Curry.
Looking back at the 3-point contest, what happens when this correction is applied?
A lot more heat.
Well, he's got it going, like you said. All of a sudden throws it a little bit long. He certainly doesn't have that normal third rhythm going for him.
Craig Hodges was a full 7% better after 3 makes across all of his 3-point contests. Even wilder, Craig wasn't even an outlier. Even if you throw out the first 3 shots where players are finding their depth and shoot measurably worse, Steph was 17 percentage points better after 3 makes. Who was number 1? Checking in.
Up next, Hubert Davis. Hubert Davis from Dallas, former New York Knicks.
Hubert Davis? Hubert was a staggering 36 percentage points better after 3 makes. And this gets into one of the original reasons Joshua and Adam wanted to do the study, to see if certain players experienced more heat than others. So this GVT study, this original study that had been drilled into our heads, one of the most influential papers of all time, gospel to the smart guys, proved wrong by new smart guys? The OGs weren't going to go silently into the night.
That blog post just blew up. So Daniel Kahneman reached out to Maya Bar-Hillel. They wrote a working paper response that was supposed to find the flaws, and they didn't find the flaws. They ended up confirming what we had.
Do behavioral economists hate when people's intuition is correct? This wasn't a video game, a fun simulation for kids. It was just math. But the thing is, this is controlled shooting. What about in a game?
In a Harvard study titled The Hot Hand, A New Approach to an Old Fallacy, they took a look at a key assumption in that GVT study, the idea that each shot was independent from another. And they found through player tracking that players were more likely to take shots more frequently and further out if they were experiencing heat. And that is important.
This only confirms what we have all experienced. The J.R. Smith heat check. However, there isn't much more we can confidently squeeze out of this tracking data, at least not at the moment.
Based on simulations that we've done, the trajectory information is very noisy.
There might just be too much noise for spectators to determine in-game when a player has crossed that threshold of heat. And additionally, heat is a rather vague term. Looking at it shot to shot, that's just one way to measure it. Personally, I always felt like it was more of a night-to-night feeling. I think we can all relate to, well, there's just days that we feel better than others. So I wanted to look at measuring momentum in a different way.
Mark Lieb, who's a data scientist and fan of the channel, reached out and offered to help bring this to life, which I am super thankful for. Since the hot hand is mostly thought of from a shooting standpoint, we charted players that had a minimum of 50 games and 6 3-pointers attempted per game. The y-axis is looking at 3-point percentage consistency using the coefficient of variance, which measures the standard deviation relative to the average. It's essentially how consistent a player is night to night shooting the 3-ball. The lower the player, the more consistent they are. The x-axis is simply just looking at 3-point accuracy or 3-point percentage.
So for example, guys like James Harden and Devin Booker, they shoot relatively the same 3-point percentage as Luka, but the standard deviation is far more significant. The streakiness, so to speak, game to game, is far more significant. But I also think that players, media, and coaches tend to overestimate this effect.
Wow, he is red.
Additionally, coaches seem privy to making rotational decisions off of just a few shots. Perhaps an action bias, coaches who seem to be fooled by randomness. That's the point of understanding analytics and science, by the way, because intuition feels just as good when it's right as it does when it's wrong.
In a way, we underestimated ourselves. We took for granted our supercomputer, our perception, our intuition. The hot hand was widely accepted, then it became a fallacy, then eventually that fallacy was actually a fallacy. And notably, all of that happened through science and statistics. Stats don't care about your feelings, but if you go about the measurement wrong, or maybe you have a bias going into it, you can find a completely different result. And that result might create a completely different belief, one that fools some of the brightest minds in statistics for decades. The hot hand is real. It's not magic. Momentum is a real thing. And that is awesome.